It began with a closed-door meeting inside Bagshot Park so secretive that even senior aides were abruptly dismissed from the corridor outside. By dawn, Sophie's expression told the story the palace refused to confirm. The Duchess of Edinburgh, long viewed as the monarchy's quiet stabilizer, had walked away from royal patronage negotiations after Prince James allegedly lost his long-anticipated path to the Wessex title. What began as a private disagreement was rapidly becoming a devastating dynastic rupture. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the atmosphere inside Bagshot Park had been tense for days before the meeting ever took place. Palace administrative streams, ranging from staff whispers to constitutional briefings, allegedly pointed toward a sudden change in long-standing succession discussions tied to Prince James and the future of the Wessex line. What made the situation even more chilling was not simply the secrecy surrounding the gathering, but the extraordinary effort to contain information afterward. According to insiders familiar with royal scheduling procedures, even senior household aides were instructed to leave entire sections of the corridor empty while Sophie, Prince Edward, and a small group of constitutional advisors remained locked in discussion behind heavy wooden doors for hours. No official statement followed. No clarification emerged. Yet within royal circles, silence often speaks louder than declarations. For years, Prince James had quietly been viewed as the symbolic continuation of Edward and Sophie's branch of the monarchy. Different interpretations of previous palace arrangements suggested that the Wessex title carried more than ceremonial meaning. It represented continuity, loyalty, and a promise deeply connected to Queen Elizabeth II's long-term vision for the monarchy's future. That was why the sudden whispers surrounding James allegedly losing his path to the title sent shockwaves through both palace staff and royal commentators alike. Why would a carefully maintained understanding suddenly be revisited now? And more importantly, who inside the institution had pushed for it? Those questions only intensified after Sophie was seen leaving Windsor visibly emotional later that same evening. Witnesses claimed the Duchess appeared unusually shaken, moving quickly past waiting staff without offering her customary smile or greeting. For a woman often described as one of the monarchy's most composed and disciplined figures, the moment felt profoundly out of character. Media insiders soon began quietly comparing notes, with several royal correspondents suggesting that tensions surrounding future title structures had been building for months beneath the polished surface of royal life. Some even pointed toward recent internal restructuring discussions allegedly connected to King Charles's long-term vision of a slimmer monarchy. But the reality reveals something far more unsettling than a routine administrative disagreement. According to reports circulating among palace observers, aides were specifically instructed to avoid discussing future title structures. Altogether, an unusually direct order within an institution built on hierarchy, protocol, and endless internal briefings. That silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured speculation. Was James being quietly sidelined as part of a broader royal transition? Had Edward and Sophie's years of unwavering loyalty suddenly become politically inconvenient? Inside a monarchy increasingly focused on consolidating power around the direct line of succession? The public reaction, meanwhile, began shifting rapidly from curiosity to concern. Royal supporters who long viewed Sophie and Edward as dutiful guardians of stability started questioning whether centuries-old understandings inside the House of Windsor were now being rewritten behind closed doors. Media commentators from London to New York began describing the issue not merely as a title dispute, but as evidence of a deeper institutional fracture emerging at the worst possible moment for the crown. Because with King Charles continuing his health battle since early 2024, and Prince William gradually preparing for the immense responsibilities of the future, the monarchy could hardly afford another internal conflict, threatening its carefully maintained image of unity. And yet, according to those familiar with the palace's increasingly tense atmosphere, this conflict had already evolved beyond private disappointment. It was becoming emotional, personal, even dangerous in the context of royal family dynamics. Sophie, who spent years protecting the institution during some of its most turbulent modern crises, allegedly believed the foundations beneath her own family were now beginning to shift. And if that was true, then the implications stretched far beyond Prince James alone. But the real shock was not merely the possible loss of a title, it was what the decision revealed about the monarchy's hidden battle over legacy. bloodline, and survival itself. For decades, the Wessex title was treated almost like an unwritten covenant within the House of Windsor, a promise forged quietly between Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Edward long before the chaos of modern royal politics began tearing through the institution. Long before palace tensions, succession anxieties, and whispers of internal division consumed the monarchy, the arrangement surrounding Edward's future had reportedly been understood inside royal circles as both symbolic and deeply personal. When Edward married Sophie in 1999 and was granted the title Earl of Wessex, palace insiders described the decision as unusually deliberate. It was never viewed as a temporary gesture or a decorative honor handed out for ceremony alone. According to various interpretations shared over the years by royal historians and commenters, the title represented the foundation of a future royal branch carefully designed by Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip themselves. Reports suggest that behind closed doors, there was an informal understanding that the Duke of Edinburgh title, one of the most respected designations within the monarchy, would eventually move through Edward's line. It was not merely about rank, it was about legacy. Prince Philip reportedly viewed Edward as the son most closely aligned with his own sense of discipline, restraint, and institutional loyalty. Unlike the explosive dramas that would later consume other members of the royal family, Edward and Sophie spent decades operating quietly in service to the crown, rarely seeking headlines, rarely provoking controversy, and almost never breaking royal protocol. Within palace walls, that loyalty allegedly mattered far more than the public ever realized. That is precisely why the growing uncertainty surrounding Prince James struck such a nerve inside the institution. James was never expected to become a central celebrity royal. In many ways, that was the point. Palace observers often described him as representing continuity rather than spectacle. A future rooted in stability, discretion, and the quieter traditions of royal duty. The idea that he would one day inherit the Wessex legacy carried enormous symbolic weight because it reinforced the belief that loyalty inside the monarchy was still rewarded, that sacrifices still mattered. That decades spent protecting the institution would not simply be erased during moments of political restructuring. And yet, as King Charles III gradually advanced plans for a slimmed-down monarchy following his accession, tensions reportedly began surfacing beneath the polished image of royal unity. What had once looked like a stable succession arrangement suddenly became vulnerable to reinterpretation. Palace historians familiar with royal constitutional traditions allegedly started describing Wessex as part of the monarchy's sacred geography, tied not only to titles but to the careful balancing of royal bloodlines that had preserved the institution for generations. But the reality reveals something far more ruthless beneath those traditions. A slimmer monarchy inevitably meant fewer working royals, fewer official roles, and fewer guarantees for secondary branches of the family. Different interpretations of palace restructuring plans suggest Edward's branch increasingly found itself drifting toward the margins of future royal strategy. As Prince William's future reign slowly became the focus of long-term planning, insiders whisper that power consolidation around the direct line of succession intensified dramatically. In that environment, promises made decades earlier allegedly began losing political value. And for Sophie, that realization may have cut deeper than anyone inside the palace initially understood, because this was never simply about aristocratic privilege or ceremonial prestige. According to those close to royal administrative circles, Sophie viewed the possible sidelining of James as a betrayal of decades spent defending the crown during some of its darkest and most humiliating modern crises. She had stood by the institution through scandals, public outrage, family fractures, and relentless media scrutiny. Edward had done the same, quietly, relentlessly, without rebellion, without public bitterness. Which is why the sudden uncertainty surrounding the Wessex future allegedly felt less like constitutional modernization and more like the dismantling of an old royal covenant piece by piece behind closed doors. And according to palace whispers, Sophie's frustration turned into outright fury when she discovered who may have influenced the sudden reversal. Insiders whisper that the battle over James's future did not begin with constitutional reform, but with a brutal internal struggle between competing royal factions fighting to control the monarchy's future after King Charles. Behind the carefully managed appearances of unity, charity visits, and ceremonial tradition, reports suggest a far more unforgiving conflict had been unfolding quietly within palace walls for years. As King Charles's health struggles continued to cast uncertainty over the long-term stability of the crown, different power centers inside the monarchy allegedly began preparing for a future that many senior royals were unwilling to discuss publicly. And according to those familiar with internal palace dynamics, that preparation came with consequences for anyone viewed as outside the monarchy's streamlined future vision. At the center of the tension stood the increasingly controversial idea of a slimmed-down monarchy, a concept King Charles had reportedly favored long before ascending the throne. On paper, the strategy sounded practical: fewer working royals, reduced public costs, a tighter institution focused primarily around the sovereign and direct heirs. But the reality reveals something far more complicated. Because inside a centuries-old monarchy built on hierarchy, symbolism, and bloodline balance, removing roles from secondary royal branches does not simply create efficiency. It creates winners and losers. And according to palace administrative streams, Edward and Sophie increasingly feared their family was drifting toward the losing side of that equation. Reports suggest senior advisors close to the future direction of the monarchy began prioritizing a structure centered heavily around Prince William and his immediate family. Royal commentators described it as a gradual consolidation of influence designed to strengthen the crown during an era of instability, scandal, and declining public trust. But for Sophie, the shift allegedly felt deeply personal. Insiders whisper that she believed Edward's branch was not merely being reduced, it was being quietly erased from long-term royal prominence altogether. The same family members once praised, admired for loyalty, discipline, and restraint were now allegedly being treated as politically expendable within a monarchy desperate to modernize before the next reign began. That perception only intensified as smaller royal households reportedly found themselves increasingly marginalized behind the scenes. Funding discussions became tighter, patronage structures were reevaluated. Public visibility shifted heavily toward William and Catherine's future role at the center of the institution. According to several palace observers, courtiers had even started privately referring to secondary royals as dispensable assets, language that sent shockwaves through staff loyal to Edward and Sophie. Because within royal history, those words carried dangerous implications. The House of Windsor had survived for generations partly because it maintained delicate balances between senior and supporting branches of the family. Once those balances collapsed, fractures often followed. Different interpretations of recent palace restructuring talks suggest Sophie did not quietly accept those changes. In fact, reports claim she resisted internal pressure repeatedly during negotiations tied to future patronage, distributions, and royal workload planning. What made the situation explosive was not simply disagreement over ceremonial duties, but the growing belief that long-standing understandings involving Prince James were being sacrificed to satisfy a broader political strategy surrounding the future monarchy. Sophie allegedly viewed that strategy as cold, calculated, and dismissive of decades spent defending the institution through crises that threatened its survival. Royal historians soon began comparing the situation to previous dynastic exclusions scattered throughout Windsor history, moments when once valued branches of the family slowly disappeared from influence as new heirs consolidated authority. Some commentators even warned that the monarchy risked repeating one of its oldest mistakes, undervaluing the quiet figures who stabilized the institution while rewarding only visibility and direct succession. And as whispers spread through palace corridors, one question kept surfacing again and again. If Edward and Sophie, arguably two of the monarchy's most disciplined loyalists, could suddenly find themselves sidelined, then what did loyalty inside the modern crown truly mean anymore? That question reportedly haunted Sophie more than anyone realized. Because according to those close to the situation, she no longer believed this was simply about titles, patronages, or constitutional modernization. She believed a line had been crossed, a promise broken. And once that realization fully settled in, the Duchess of Edinburgh allegedly stopped viewing the conflict as a misunderstanding that could quietly disappear behind palace walls. But the conflict escalated dramatically when Sophie reportedly made a decision that stunned even the palace old guard. Then came the moment no one expected. Sophie, often described as the monarchy's calmest and most disciplined figure, allegedly walked out of sensitive royal patronage negotiations altogether, leaving stunned officials scrambling behind palace walls. For years, the Duchess of Edinburgh had built a reputation as one of the last truly dependable figures inside the modern monarchy. While scandals consumed headlines and royal divisions erupted publicly across television screens and newspaper front pages, Sophie remained measured, controlled, and fiercely loyal to the institution. That was precisely why her sudden withdrawal from Mayam internal discussions sent such shockwaves through royal circles. People inside the palace were accustomed to emotional reactions from rebellious royals, disgruntled former insiders, or ambitious courtiers. They were not accustomed to Sophie losing faith. Reports suggest the breakdown occurred during a series of increasingly tense patronage restructuring meetings tied to the monarchy's future operational plans. According to insiders familiar with the discussions, the conversations were originally intended to finalize which royal households would oversee key charitable organizations and ceremonial responsibilities during the next phase of King Charles's reign. But somewhere beneath the polished language of constitutional planning, deeper tensions erupted. Palace insiders later claimed the meetings became unexpectedly hostile, with frustrations boiling over as questions surrounding Prince James's future allegedly resurfaced once again. What began as procedural debate reportedly transformed into something far more personal and emotionally charged. Different interpretations of the confrontation suggest Sophie had reached a breaking point long before she walked away. By then, the uncertainty surrounding James and the Wessex legacy was no longer viewed inside her household as a temporary misunderstanding. It had become symbolic of something larger, a growing belief that Edward's branch of the family was being systematically pushed toward irrelevance within the future monarchy. According to those close to palace operations, Sophie allegedly viewed the treatment of James as humiliating, not simply because of the title itself, but because of what its removal represented after decades of unwavering service to the crown. The same institution her family had defended through crisis after crisis now appeared willing to quietly discard them during a period of transition. Royal staff soon noticed abrupt pauses in scheduled planning sessions that had previously moved forward with military precision. Meetings were postponed, briefings delayed. Communication between royal offices reportedly became strained and unusually cautious. According to palace administrative streams, aides were instructed to avoid discussing the Duchess's withdrawal publicly while senior officials scrambled behind the scenes to contain what many feared was becoming a dangerous internal fracture. Because, within the monarchy, public silence does not erase private panic. In many cases, it confirms it. Prince Edward, meanwhile, reportedly attempted to mediate privately between competing factions inside the institution. Insiders whisper that he found himself trapped in an almost impossible position, torn between his instinctive loyalty to the crown and his growing responsibility to protect his wife and son from what they increasingly perceived as institutional betrayal. Unlike more explosive royal conflicts that had unfolded publicly in recent years, Edward allegedly fought to keep this battle contained behind palace walls. Quiet diplomacy, careful conversations, appeals for patience. But according to reports, the deeper the negotiations continued, the clearer it became that trust inside the family had already begun eroding. Once media outlets started linking Sophie's dramatic withdrawal directly to James's title uncertainty, the story exploded far beyond royal corridors. Public sympathy for Sophie and her family grew rapidly, especially among royal supporters who viewed Edward and Sophie as hard-working figures who had spent years carrying out royal duties without complaint or controversy. Commentators began openly questioning whether the monarchy was punishing loyalty while rewarding visibility and political convenience. Some even described Sophie's exit from negotiations as one of the clearest warning signs, yet that serious instability was quietly spreading beneath the surface of the House of Windsor. And perhaps most dangerously for the palace, the situation no longer looked like an isolated disagreement over patronages or titles. It looked like a monarchy struggling to hold itself together during one of the most vulnerable transitions in modern royal history. Because as tensions intensified behind closed doors, another reality became impossible to ignore. The authority that once kept these family fractures under control was beginning to weaken. Yet behind the emotional fallout lurked an even greater fear, one tied directly to King Charles's weakening authority. At the center of the storm stood King Charles III himself, physically weakened, politically cornered, and increasingly unable to contain the growing fractures spreading through the House of Windsor. For much of his life, Charles had prepared for the burden of kingship with meticulous patience, waiting. decades beneath the immense shadow of Queen Elizabeth II, while carefully shaping his own vision for the monarchy's future. Yet according to palace insiders, the reality of his reign proved far harsher and far more isolating than even he anticipated. Instead of inheriting stability, Charles reportedly found himself presiding over an institution under relentless pressure from every direction at once: family betrayals, constitutional scrutiny, public skepticism, and now an increasingly bitter internal conflict involving one of the monarchy's most loyal households. Reports suggest the king became trapped between two competing instincts that could no longer peacefully coexist. On one side stood his long-standing belief in modernization, a leaner monarchy focused tightly around the sovereign and direct heirs, designed to survive in an age of public austerity and political hostility toward inherited privilege. On the other side stood the old royal understandings that had quietly governed the House of Windsor for generations: promises, expectations, delicate family arrangements forged behind palace walls long before Charles ever took the throne. And according to different interpretations, collating through royal circles, the conflict surrounding Prince James forced those two worlds into direct collision. Charles's ongoing health struggles only deepened the crisis. Since early 2024, concerns surrounding the king's condition reportedly altered the internal balance of power inside the palace far more dramatically than the public fully understood. Royal commentators began quietly observing that as Charles reduced public appearances and focused on treatment, senior advisors and future monarchy planners allegedly gained increasing influence over long-term institutional decisions. That shift created an atmosphere of uncertainty, where competing factions inside the royal household began pushing their own visions for the monarchy's future with growing urgency. In that environment, even private family disagreements carried enormous political consequences. According to palace administrative streams, Charles did attempt private reconciliation efforts between Sophie, Edward, and those involved in the restructuring discussions. Insiders whisper that the king understood exactly how dangerous the situation had become, not only emotionally, but symbolically. Sophie and Edward were not rebellious outsiders threatening the monarchy from beyond palace gates. They were loyalists, steady figures who spent years protecting the institution without demanding public attention in return. If even they began losing trust in the system, then the crisis threatened something far deeper than headlines. It threatened the monarchy's internal foundation of duty, loyalty, and sacrifice. Sophie, however, allegedly expected more from the king than quiet mediation. Different interpretations suggest she believed Charles had both the authority and the moral responsibility to intervene personally on James's behalf before the situation spiraled out of control. To her supporters, this was not merely about constitutional planning or ceremonial titles. It was about whether decades of unwavering loyalty still carried meaning inside the crown. And as the silence continued, frustration reportedly hardened into disillusionment, because the longer the uncertainty surrounding James remained unresolved, the more it appeared that forces beyond Charles himself were shaping the monarchy's future. Many royal insiders pointed toward Prince William's long-term succession strategy as a complicating factor. Behind the scenes, reports suggest advisors preparing for the eventual transition to William's reign increasingly favored a concentrated model of royal authority centered almost entirely around the direct heir and his immediate household. That strategy may have made institutional sense from a modern public relations perspective, but within palace walls it allegedly intensified tensions between what insiders described as the old guard and the architects of the monarchy's future. One side fought to preserve traditional balances within the royal family. The other focused relentlessly on survival through consolidation. And caught between them stood a visibly exhausted king struggling to prevent those competing visions from tearing the institution apart in real time. As whispers of division spread further into the public sphere, confidence in palace stability began quietly eroding. Royal supporters who once viewed the monarchy as an unshakable symbol of continuity started questioning whether the institution still possessed the unity and discipline that defined the Elizabethan era. The carefully polished image of calm succession was beginning to fracture under the weight of uncertainty, resentment, and competing ambitions. But as the palace struggled to contain the damage, another problem emerged, one that threatened to turn private heartbreak into a public constitutional embarrassment. The moment whispers of James losing the Wessex pathway reached the press, The backlash was immediate, emotional, and deeply uncomfortable for a monarchy already battling instability on multiple fronts. What had once existed as quiet tension buried inside palace corridors suddenly exploded into public debate almost overnight. Royal commentators, constitutional analysts, tabloid editors, and longtime supporters of the crown all began circling the same troubling question. How could a family that spent decades preaching loyalty, duty, and sacrifice now appear willing to sideline two of its most dependable members? The reaction was not driven by outrage alone. It was driven by disbelief. Because to many watching from the outside, Edward and Sophie represented the very qualities the monarchy claimed it wanted to preserve during a period of historic uncertainty. Reports suggest palace officials were caught completely off guard by the scale of public sympathy that rapidly formed around Sophie and her family. Across media platforms, royal watchers accused the institution of abandoning loyal family members in favor of cold political restructuring. Different interpretations of the crisis began spreading through newspapers and television panels, with some commentators describing the situation as a devastating public relations disaster unfolding in slow motion. Others warned that the monarchy risked creating a dangerous perception that quiet service and unwavering discipline no longer carried value inside the House of Windsor, unless attached directly to the line of succession. Sophie, meanwhile, emerged as an unexpectedly powerful symbol of frustration among royal supporters. Online discussions increasingly described her as one of the monarchy's last trusted figures, a woman who had defended the institution through years of scandal, division, and reputational collapse without ever publicly complaining or seeking attention for herself. That image made the unfolding situation feel especially cruel in the eyes of many observers. Here was someone widely viewed as dignified, restrained, and relentlessly loyal now appearing emotionally wounded by the very institution she spent years protecting. And once that narrative took hold publicly, palace communications teams reportedly struggled to contain it. Commentators soon began openly questioning why lifelong service appeared to be going unrewarded inside the modern monarchy. Why dedicate decades to supporting the crown if future security, influence, and legacy could still be quietly dismantled behind closed doors? The comparison that unsettled the palace most, however, involved Prince Harry. Several royal analysts pointed out the painful contrast now emerging between Edward and Harry's respective journeys within the institution. Harry had rebelled publicly, criticized the family, released memoirs, and distanced himself from royal duty entirely. Edward had done the opposite. He stayed. He worked. He remained silent through controversy after controversy. Yet according to growing public sentiment, both brothers now appeared to share the same uncomfortable fate: gradual marginalization from the monarchy's future center of power. That comparison intensified media speculation surrounding broader royal restructuring plans. Reports suggest journalists began aggressively investigating whether the uncertainty surrounding James was part of a much larger institutional redesign already underway behind the scenes. Questions surrounding Prince William's long-term vision for the monarchy resurfaced repeatedly, alongside rumors that future royal operations would become increasingly concentrated around a smaller and more tightly controlled inner circle. Palace insiders allegedly feared the situation was beginning to create an impression of ruthless consolidation, rather than stable modernization. Behind the scenes, reports claim palace communications teams entered full containment mode. Officials allegedly monitored media coverage closely while senior aides debated how much, if anything, should be publicly addressed. But the deeper problem facing the institution was no longer informational. It was emotional. The monarchy had spent generations surviving scandals by projecting continuity, discipline, and family unity. Now, however, many loyal supporters no longer saw unity. They saw exhaustion, isolation, and perhaps most dangerously of all, they saw a royal family appearing willing to alienate its own most dependable figures during a period of unprecedented vulnerability. As the backlash intensifies, some palace observers quietly warned that the damage might extend far beyond headlines or temporary controversy. Because once public trust in royal loyalty begins to fracture, restoring it becomes painfully difficult. And according to some palace observers, the crisis may have permanently changed Sophie's relationship with the institution she spent decades defending. Behind the polished smiles and carefully staged appearances, insiders claim Sophie reached a deeply personal breaking point, one fueled not by ambition, but by the painful belief that her family's sacrifices no longer mattered to the crown. For years, she had quietly carried responsibilities that many within the institution considered essential but rarely celebrated publicly. While more visible members of the royal family dominated headlines and commanded international attention, Sophie reportedly embraced the less glamorous burden of protecting the monarchy through consistency, restraint, and unwavering discipline. She did not build her reputation through spectacle. She built it through endurance. That was precisely why the growing crisis surrounding Prince James cut so deeply. According to those familiar with the emotional atmosphere inside the Edinburgh household, Sophie no longer viewed the situation as a political disagreement over succession planning. She viewed it as proof that decades of loyalty could disappear overnight when institutional priorities shifted. Reports suggest the emotional weight of that realization began changing the dynamics inside the family itself. Prince Edward, long regarded as one of the monarchy's most quietly dependable figures, allegedly found himself caught between two impossible responsibilities. On one side stood his lifelong devotion to the crown and the institution his parents spent decades protecting. On the other stood his growing instinct to shield his wife and son from what increasingly felt like a cold and painful restructuring process unfolding behind palace walls. Insiders whisper that Edward attempted repeatedly to calm tensions, encouraging patience while quietly pursuing internal dialogue with senior figures inside the palace. But as the uncertainty surrounding James continued to dominate private conversations, those efforts reportedly became harder to sustain. Because beneath the diplomacy and constitutional language, the emotional damage insinuated to the family was already taking root. At the same time, divisions between palace factions allegedly grew sharper than ever before. Royal insiders described competing visions for the monarchy's future colliding with increasing intensity as King Charles's reign faced mounting pressure from both internal and external instability. The old guard, those who still believed the monarchy survived through balance, loyalty, and broad family support, reportedly viewed the treatment of Edward's household with growing discomfort. Meanwhile, future monarchy planners focused heavily on streamlining the institution around direct succession and concentrated visibility. The result was an atmosphere where even routine family matters suddenly carried enormous symbolic meaning. Every delayed meeting, every altered patronage plan, every silence from senior officials fed the perception that the monarchy was quietly redefining who truly mattered within its future structure. For Prince James, the situation reportedly became deeply uncomfortable in ways the public could only partially see. Different interpretations suggest he struggled with the sudden wave of media attention surrounding a future he had never publicly discussed himself. Unlike more outspoken members of the younger royal generation, James largely remained outside major public controversy for most of his life. Yet now his name had become central to a growing constitutional drama, unfolding across headlines, social media debates, and royal commentary programs. According to palace observers, the emotional pressure surrounding that scrutiny weighed heavily not only on him, but on the entire Edinburgh household. Royal staff privately described morale within the family as somber, with tensions and uncertainty casting a shadow over routines that had once operated with calm precision. As public debate intensified, comparisons to historic Windsor fractures inevitably resurfaced. Royal historians began recalling previous moments when divisions inside the monarchy slowly widened until private grievances evolved into generational wounds. The parallels unsettled many observers because the House of Windsor had spent years trying to project the image of a family that learned from its past mistakes. Yet now, according to some commentators, the institution appeared dangerously close to repeating one of its oldest patterns, allowing now power struggles and succession politics to overshadow emotional loyalty and family trust. And perhaps most troubling of all was the growing sense that the monarchy's internal unity had become far more fragile than anyone publicly admitted. The carefully controlled image of discipline and continuity no longer felt unshakable. Instead, beneath the polished ceremonies and measured public appearances, the institution increasingly appeared divided between competing visions of survival itself. But the final consequence of this royal fallout may not be about titles at all. It may be about the future shape of the monarchy itself. What began as a dispute over one young royal's future has evolved into something far larger, a chilling test of whether the modern monarchy still rewards loyalty or merely protects power. In the beginning, the controversy surrounding Prince James and the Wessex pathway appeared contained, almost manageable. Like another temporary storm, the House of Windsor could quietly absorb behind carefully rehearsed statements and polished public appearances. But as the weeks unfolded and palace silence deepened, the situation transformed into something much more dangerous. It became symbolic, a reflection of the monarchy's growing identity crisis during one of the most uncertain transitions in its modern history. Because beneath the discussions over titles and succession structures lurked a far more unsettling question: what kind of royal institution is now emerging behind palace walls, and who will still belong within it when the transition is complete? Reports suggest the Wessex controversy has exposed anxieties inside the monarchy that stretch far beyond Edward and Sophie alone. Royal commentators increasingly describe the situation as evidence of a crown struggling to balance survival with tradition, modernization with loyalty, and consolidation with family unity. The monarchy has always depended on a delicate illusion: the belief that duty and sacrifice are ultimately recognized, even if quietly. That belief helped sustain the institution through wars, scandals, divorces, abdications, and public outrage across generations. Yet according to growing public sentiment, the treatment of Sophie and her family has begun shaking that illusion in uncomfortable ways. If even the monarchy's most disciplined loyalists can suddenly find themselves pushed to the side, marred uncertainty, then what security truly exists for anyone outside the direct line of succession? Sophie's withdrawal from critical negotiations reportedly became a turning point not simply because of what she did, but because of what her actions appeared to represent. For decades, she embodied stability inside a monarchy repeatedly thrown into chaos by louder and more rebellious personalities. She represented restraint, endurance, quiet service carried out without public bitterness. That is why many palace observers believe her visible disillusionment sent such shockwaves through royal circles. Different interpretations suggest it signaled a growing emotional exhaustion spreading quietly inside the institution itself, an exhaustion born from years of sacrifice colliding with an increasingly ruthless focus on image management and concentrated power. At the same time, Prince William's future reign is now being framed by many commentators as a defining battle over the monarchy's structure and identity moving forward. Reports suggest advisors surrounding the Prince of Wales remain deeply committed to a streamlined institution built around efficiency, visibility, and tighter control over our royal influence. Supporters argue such changes are necessary for survival in a modern political climate increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege. But critics warn the strategy risks creating a colder and more transactional monarchy, one where family branches once valued for loyalty and support gradually become expendable if they no longer fit the institution's future design. And within that debate lies the unresolved question haunting this entire crisis: can Prince James's royal future still be restored, or has the monarchy already crossed a line it cannot easily reverse? Behind palace walls, pressure continues mounting to preserve unity during a period already overshadowed by uncertainty surrounding King Charles's health and the looming transition toward the next reign. Royal insiders warn that emotional scars caused by this conflict may linger long after public headlines fade away. Because institutions built on symbolism depend heavily on trust between family members, trust between generations, and trust between the monarchy and the public itself. Once that trust begins eroding internally, even the strongest royal structures can become fragile beneath the surface. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the Wessex controversy. Not simply a dispute over titles, patronages, or constitutional planning, but a painful reminder that the monarchy's greatest vulnerability has never been scandal alone. It has always been the quiet fractures that grow inside the family itself, while the world watches from outside the gates. The crown may survive transitions, public anger, and political pressure. It has done so for centuries, but survival often comes at a cost, and according to palace observers, that cost may now include relationships that can never fully be repaired. Because within the House of Windsor, titles may be inherited, but trust, once broken behind palace walls, can echo through generations. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.